as Heather just mentioned a minute ago, the study itself that I did, and I just finished this about a year ago, not even a year ago yet. It's the effects of emotional support dogs on anxiety, depression, and somatization in elementary students. A topic near and dear to my heart. But before we start, what I'd like to be able to do is just go on a brief history of dogs, because it really makes a difference in terms of where we're at. If you take a look at this chart, you'll see there's the wolf, Canis lupus, 40,000 years ago, and there's this gap between 40,000 and 15,000 years. That was the domestication of Canis lupus familiaris, which is who we are dealing with now, our regular dogs. Archaeologically, 20,000 years isn't a whole lot of time. And so you can see that this domestication happened fairly quickly, and it paralleled. The gray wolf was the competitor to man. Actually, they were basically taking the same prey, and this was quite a different change of environment. In Siberia, in 2018, this young dog pup was found. It was actually called Dogor. And just to give you an idea of what that 20,000 period of time might look like, this was near the end of the domestication period. The archaeologists that found this pup in frozen in an iceberg in Siberia still can't tell whether it's a dog or a wolf. And so it's a they call these proto-wolves. These were the first domesticated sort of animals. Now, I'm going to jump ahead really far, and we're going to go to the first pet therapy dogs, and that was in the Renaissance. If you take a look at an awful lot of photos, you'll see the lady of the manor, and she'll have her dog on her lap. There's a lot of literature that shows these dogs were basically constant companions for these ladies of the house, these manor ladies. They looked after their domestics, and they entertained people, but generally speaking, the dog acted as their confidant, as their support network, and gave them nourishment and caring. Same thing with the children as well. Now I'm going to, real brief history, so I'm going to jump ahead really quickly to an incident that happened in an institute penitentiary in 1924. This is Pep. Pep's a black lab, and Pep was convicted in Pennsylvania at the Pennsylvania Penitentiary by Governor Gifford Pinchot of killing the family cat. Back then, the penitentiary was an interesting place. It wasn't there to redeem people, but rather it was there to just punish them for the crimes that they did. So they weren't allowed to talk, they weren't allowed to socialize, they weren't allowed to do anything. And it was a terrible place to be. Pinchot couldn't talk about rehabilitation. He couldn't do any of that with the board. He couldn't do that with the population. And so he concocted this story. And what happened was they sentenced Pep to the penitentiary, and Pep did not have a cell. He just wandered around, and he worked with the prisoners, and it made their lives just that much better. So it's the first recorded time in the 20th century where an institution used an approach to pet therapy. About 10 years later, we have Freud. Freud had his dog. It was a Chow Chow. And if anybody knows about Chow Chows, the weird little thing about them is that they have a purple tongue. So Joffe, his dog, was in all of his psychoanalytical sessions. Freud said it set the tone and a calmness in the session so that he could do his work to the best of his ability. He was a dog lover, and you can see the quote, "Dogs love their friends and bite their enemies," quite different from people who are incapable of pure love and always mix hate and love. So he obviously had a point on that. The study that I'm talking about today has its roots in the human bond theory framework. And there's really three universal truths. Rousseau kind of laid them out quite nicely back in 1999. And basically that there's a distinct relationship between a human and animal, that relationship is reciprocal. And thirdly, that it's also mutually fulfilling, whether it be negative or positive. In this case, in this study, I hope it's going to be a positive, fulfilling relationship. A summary of the study, really quickly, we had 68 elementary students from the North Okanagan area. They were in grade 5. All students had elevated scores of anxiety, depression, or somatization, the BASC-3. The BASC-3 is the Behavior Assessment Survey for Children, Full Reliability and Validity. TRS is the Teacher Rating Scale. There's a sub-scale in the BASC, and that is for anxiety, depression, or somatization. We were able to have two groups, the treatment group, which had the dog, and the dog was for 2 hours a week for 24 weeks in the classroom. And then the control group, which didn't have a dog at all. It's a quantitative study. So we were looking at pre and post, and we were looking at the test scores between that interval of time, the 24 weeks. And then we looked at how those scores were impacted with the introduction of an emotional support dog. As I said before, they're elementary students. It was archival data. The population was in that district. It was H-coded. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute or two and why that's important. And these H students were in these various different classrooms. The sampling itself for the students, they were selected through the district, through the H process. And as I said, there were 28 classrooms and 14 schools were represented in the composition. The reason why the H process is important is because that's the way student services in schools and districts in British Columbia get their money. Various different special ed categories have a funding piece attributed to them. So in this case, category H is intense behavior intervention. The students are serious mental illness. And once all the requirements are fulfilled, the government or the district receives $10,750. Actually, they receive it in two different parts. They receive it in October, and then they receive it again in February. So what a district will do to make money for student services, which supports all the different programs and EAs and what the likes, is they make sure that the student meets all the criteria necessary. If you take a look very quickly, you'll see one of the criteria is a behavioral assessment. And so that was where the archival data came from. That subset of anxiety, depression, and somatization is a subset, and that information had never been looked at in any way. So this was an opportunity to look at the score. They do the assessment twice a year. They do it in September, and then they do it again in February. And so to make sure that the student still qualifies to be in that category. And so we had a great opportunity there to test the student in September and then retest in January, end of January, beginning of February, to see whether or not the exposure to the dog had made a difference. So there was quite an incentive for them to do all this process, and all that testing was done by district personnel, had nothing to do with the researchers at all. So in terms of tests and things like that, we did a test for assumptions for normality, sphericity, values of skewness and kurtosis, multivariate outliers, and homogeneity of variances. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details here because they are in my slideshow, but I will show you the graphs. You can see that in anxiety with the treatment group went down but went up with the control group. Same thing with depression. You can see the same thing that happened. The depression was at one point and continued up, whereas with the treatment group, it started at a point and went down. And finally, the same thing with somatization. You saw the somatization increased over time, and that in the treatment group, somatization decreased. So the hypotheses were pretty straightforward, and they were all confirmed, and that simply is that the interaction between pre and post treatment on anxiety showed that the sport dogs did make a difference on changing the scores. The same thing happened with depression. We saw that it was also confirmed that the scores of those that were exposed to the emotional support dog did decrease, and the same thing happened with somatization as well. Now, part of the problems with the study, of course, is there's always something. Within this field, and this study that was conducted in, there's not a lot of qualitative work. Most of it's quantitative. There's been an awful lot of surveys done, questionnaires done to teachers, but again, we deal with some of the other things that go on here. Inconsistencies of operational definitions. That's slowly becoming resolved as more and more studies are looking at dogs and their effect on students. Sample size has been a difficulty. Here we only have 68 students. There is potential, and we'll talk about that in a minute or two, to replicate the study very easily, because every district has to have that archival data of some sort, whether it be a Connors, Achenbach, or a Basque. The data collection process was limited in that it was done by district personnel, and unfortunately, if you were to do it large scale, it would probably cost student services a fair amount of money in terms of personnel to do that. Which can cause a bit of a problem. And the classroom composition, one of the things you'll see with the study is that we did not differentiate between female and male students because we didn't have enough, and it would have skewed the results. A larger study with a larger sample size would allow us certainly to take a look at male and female differences as well. In terms of the literature, there's not a vast amount of literature in the last little bit. This field is starting to burgeon bit by bit, and most of it shows that emotional support dogs do reduce student aggression and contribute to social and cognitive development in children as well. Recommendations for the future. The study can be replicated, but one of the nice things would be is to do it in different geographic areas. See if there's a difference between, central Okanagan and Vancouver or Surrey, or even a different province for that matter. Research included data collection process, refine the process so it's a little more streamlined. Again, we talked about definitions. Now the literature is getting to a point where some of the definitions of what an emotional support dog represents and the likes is pretty standardized now in research. So that's only been in the last 2-3 years. And then determine if there is an impact on externalizing behavior. So although we looked at internalizing emotions such as anxiety, depression, and somatization, we could see what the scores were like on hyperactivity, aggression, and conduct problems. And that would be an interesting process. Again, we could, if there's a district using a Basque, Connors doesn't show this on their subscale, but the Achenbach would. So it would be an interesting possibility as well to take a look at. Conclusions, there is an impact on students that are exposed to an emotional support dog as little as 2 hours a week for 24 weeks. The study itself adds to the body of literature regarding quantitative studies, which are, as I said, few and far between right now in this field. It seems the quantitative way is the choice for most of these studies on dogs. It could act as an early identification for students in terms of anxiety, depression, and somatization, which could help in terms of getting counseling, in terms of getting support for kids. And it's an easy, low-cost way of doing it. And that brings me to the last point, which is this program, although training a dog, you have to go through a St. John's process. There's also workers' compensation, and there's SPCA rules and things that you have to follow. But in terms of the classroom teacher, we're really talking about a dog who's has an ambient presence in the classroom. They don't typically have a program. They might sit down with the student with reading. They might sit down near a student's desk. But in terms of what that dog does, it doesn't necessarily have to interact through a designed program. Many teachers within their curriculum will include the dog with students and the likes, but it isn't essential. And the literature showed just the ambient presence alone helps in terms of reducing cortisol and anxiety in students. So it's a low-cost program. It's easy to implement. and the benefits seem to be very, very high. The really neat part of this is that it works in lower grades as well, K to 1, 2, and 3, which would be a great way of making kids really feel comfortable being in an environment where they can learn and they can feel stress-free as well. So there's a lot of potential perks to the whole process. The next few slides, I think there's about another 20, I have all the references in there. If you're interested in following up on here, the research regarding any of this topic. And I'll open it up for questions.